In the dry heat of the afternoon, a wealthy man steps out of a black truck into a dusty clearing at the center of his isolated property. In the back seat, his 12-year-old daughter, scared and silent, stares at the shovel resting on the front seat. He opens the door and orders her out without a word. A few meters away, a white horse watches, ears perked, nostrils flaring. The man tells the girl to step into the shallow grave already dug. Her hands are tied, her breath held. She obeys. The horse grows agitated, whinnies and charges across the dry earth, kicking up dust and startling hidden birds. What happens next? No one is prepared to see. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and never miss one. Thank you for joining us. Now, back to our story. The shovel bit into the hard Texas earth with a sound that seemed to echo through Samuel Morrison's very soul. Each thrust of the metal blade sent tremors up his weathered arms, but nothing compared to the trembling in his chest. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows across the Morrison ranch that had been in his family for 4 generations. Sweat dripped from his brow, mixing salt with the tears he refused to acknowledge. 12-year-old Emma sat on the wooden fence 30 yards away, her small hands gripping the weathered rails until her knuckles turned white. Her cornflower blue eyes never left her father's hunched figure as he dug deeper into the earth behind their old oak tree. The same tree where she'd carved her initials next to Tommy Henderson's just last week, where she'd shared her first innocent, a kiss, and discovered the fluttering sensation that adults called love. "Daddy, please," she whispered, though her voice carried no further than the evening breeze that rustled through the tall prairie grass. "Please listen to me." But Samuel Morrison was a man consumed. The phone call from Mrs. Henderson that morning had shattered his world more completely than the drought of '92 or the cattle disease that nearly bankrupted them in '98. His 12-year-old daughter, his precious Emma, was pregnant. The shame of it burned through him like wildfire, threatening to consume everything he'd built, everything his family name represented in Millfield County. The shovel struck a rock, jarring his shoulders and sending a sharp pain up his spine. He paused, breathing heavily, and for a moment allowed himself to look at Emma. She looked so small perched on that fence, her auburn hair catching the dying light like spun copper. She wore the yellow sundress his late wife had sewn for her. Last birthday, the one with tiny daisies that made her look even younger than her 12 years. How could this have happened? How could his innocent little girl have brought such disgrace upon their family? Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no clouds marred the clear sky. Samuel realized it wasn't thunder at all, but the approach of hoofbeats. Ranger, Emma's palomino stallion, came galloping across the pasture with his golden coat gleaming and his white mane flowing like a banner. The horse had been Emma's constant companion since her mother's passing 3 years ago, a gift from Samuel during his daughter's darkest days of grief. Ranger slowed as he neared the fence, his intelligent dark eyes taking in the scene with an awareness that sometimes unnerved Samuel. The horse had always been protective of Emma, once even placing himself between her and a rattlesnake, standing perfectly still until Samuel could arrive with his rifle. Now Ranger approached with cautious steps, his ears twitching forward and back as if sensing the danger that hung in the air like morning mist. Emma slipped down from the fence and wrapped her arms around Ranger's neck, burying her face in his. "Mayne?" "He won't listen, Ranger," she whispered. "He thinks I'm going to have a baby, but I'm not. I'm just in love." "That's not the same thing, is it?" Samuel's hands tightened on the shovel handle. Love. At 12 years old, she spoke of love as if she understood its consequences, its weight. But love had consequences in Millfield County, especially for the daughter of a man who sat on the church board and whose family had helped found this town. Love led to whispers behind church pews, pointed fingers at the general store, and shame that would follow Emma for the rest of her life. The hole was nearly 3 feet deep now, and Samuel's back ached with each movement. He'd started this terrible task 2 hours ago, when the weight of Mrs. Henderson's words had finally settled into his bones like winter cold. Emma Morrison was pregnant, she'd said with that superior tone she used when delivering bad news. Saw her myself at the clinic in Beaumont when I took Tommy for his checkup. The girl was in the waiting room, looking green around the gills. But Mrs. Henderson had been wrong. Emma wasn't pregnant. She'd simply been carsick. From the long ride to Beaumont, where she'd gone with the Henderson family to see a movie. The nausea Mrs. Henderson had witnessed was nothing more than motion sickness, but in a town where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, the truth often got lost in the telling. Samuel didn't know this. All he knew was the crushing weight of perceived shame and the desperate need to preserve his family's honor. In his twisted logic, if Emma was gone, if she simply disappeared, the scandal would disappear with her. People would assume she'd been sent away to relatives, a common enough occurrence when families faced such troubles. Ranger stepped closer to the fence, his body positioning itself between Emma and her father. The horse's head was high, ears pinned back slightly in a warning posture that Samuel had seen before, when the animal sensed danger to his young mistress. A low rumble emanated from the stallion's chest, not quite a whinny, but more than a sigh. "I know, boy," Emma said softly, stroking Ranger's neck. "I'm scared too." The admission hung in the air like a prayer. Samuel paused again, his chest heaving from exertion and emotion. When he looked up, he saw Emma standing beside Ranger, both of them watching him with expressions of confusion and growing fear. For just a moment, doubt crept into his mind like morning fog rolling across the pasture. But then he remembered the phone call, remembered Mrs. Henderson's voice dripping with false sympathy as she delivered the news that would destroy his family's reputation. He remembered the way his hands had shaken as he'd hung up the phone, the way his vision had blurred as he'd reached for the bottle of bourbon he kept hidden behind the flour in the kitchen pantry. The shovel resumed its rhythmic cutting into the earth. Each scoop of dirt landed with a soft thud on the growing pile beside the hole. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and red that reminded Samuel of better times, when Emma was small and innocent, and the future held nothing but promise. Ranger nickered softly, a sound that was almost conversational, as if he were trying to reason with the man who had once cared for him as tenderly as he cared for Emma. The horse took a step forward, then another, until he was standing at the very edge of the fence that separated the pasture from the area where Samuel dug. Emma followed, her small hand resting on Ranger's shoulder for support. "Daddy," she called out, her voice stronger now but still trembling with emotion. "Daddy, I need to tell you something important." Samuel's movement slowed, but didn't stop. The hole was nearly 4 feet deep now, the dimensions of a grave, though. He tried not to think of it in those terms. This was just a hole, just a temporary solution to an impossible problem. Emma would be safe here, hidden away until he could figure out what to do next. Mrs. Henderson was wrong, Emma continued, her voice carrying across the evening air with crystal clarity. "I'm not having a baby. I don't even know how babies are made. I just know that I love Tommy Henderson and he loves me, and we want to get married someday when we're grown up." The words struck Samuel like physical blows, but his mind, clouded by alcohol and desperation, couldn't process their meaning. All he could think about was the shame, the whispers, the way people would look at his family in church on Sunday morning. All he could see was the destruction of everything he'd worked for, everything his father and grandfather had built. Ranger whinnied again, this time louder and more insistent. The sound seemed to echo off the barn and the farmhouse. carrying across the fields where cattle grazed in peaceful ignorance of the drama unfolding near the old oak tree. Other horses in the distant pasture raised their heads at the sound, as if sensing that one of their own was in distress. The light was fading now, and Samuel knew he was running out of time. Soon, other ranch hands would return from their work. In the far fields, soon neighbors might come calling, as they often did on Sunday evenings. He had to finish this terrible task before anyone could stop him, before anyone could see what desperation had driven him to do. But as he lifted the shovel for another scoop of earth, Samuel Morrison caught sight of his reflection in the metal blade. The face that stared back at him was that of a stranger, hollow-eyed and wild with grief and fear. It was the face of a man who had lost his way, who had let shame and pride override love and reason. For just a moment, the shovel trembled in his hands. The shovel resumed its steady rhythm, but something had changed in the air around the Morrison ranch. Ranger sensed it first, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, picking up signals from across the vast Texas landscape. The golden stallion's nostrils flared as he caught scents carried on the evening. Breeze, the familiar smells of cattle and hay, but also something else, something that made his powerful muscles tense beneath his gleaming coat. Emma pressed her face deeper into Ranger's mane, inhaling the comforting scent of horse and sunshine. That always made her feel safe. "He's not himself," she whispered to her four-legged friend. "Ever since Mama went to heaven, Daddy gets confused sometimes. He sees danger where there isn't any." The hole was deeper now, nearly deep enough for Samuel to stand in up to his chest. His movements had become mechanical, driven by a desperate urgency that blocked out everything else. The bourbon he'd consumed earlier had dulled his reasoning, but sharpened his single-minded focus. In his mind, he was saving his family's honor, preserving the Morrison name that had meant something in Millfield County for over a century. But 12-year-old Emma Morrison wasn't pregnant. The truth was far simpler and infinitely more innocent than the gossip that had reached her father's ears. She was in love, the pure, uncomplicated love of childhood that consisted of shared glances in Sunday school, passed notes during arithmetic class, and stolen moments behind the schoolhouse during recess. Tommy Henderson, the banker's son, had been her best friend since they were 5 years old. Last month, during the church picnic, he'd worked up the courage to hold her hand during the evening prayer. Last week, beneath the very oak tree where her father now dug with such grim determination, Tommy had kissed her cheek and promised to marry her when they were both 18 and old enough to make such decisions. Mrs. Henderson had seen Emma at the clinic in Beaumont, that much was true. But the 12-year-old had been there with the Henderson family, accompanying them on a trip to the big city. Emma had never been in a car for such a long journey, and the winding roads had made her stomach churn and her face turn green. While Tommy had his routine checkup with the doctor, Emma had sat in the waiting room, trying not to be sick on the clean tile floors. To Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes and gossiping tongue, a young girl looking nauseous in a doctor's office could mean only one thing. The banker's wife had returned to Millfield County with a story that grew more scandalous with each telling, until it reached Samuel Morrison's ears in the most damning form possible. Ranger snorted and pawed the ground with his front hoof, a deep rumble emanating from his chest that was part worry and part warning. The horse's bond with Emma went beyond the typical relationship between a girl and her mount. When Emma's mother, Sarah, had been dying of the cancer that slowly consumed her gentle spirit, she'd made Samuel promise to always protect their daughter. It was Ranger who had filled the void left by Sarah's passing, becoming Emma's constant companion, confidant, and protector. Now, as Samuel dug deeper into the earth beneath their special tree, Ranger's protective instincts were in full alert. The stallion could sense the wrongness of the situation. The way Emma's small body trembled with fear, the wild desperation in Samuel's movements. In the animal kingdom, Ranger would have intervened physically, but years of training held him back. Still, his intelligent eyes never left the man with the shovel, watching for any sign that he might need to break through the fence that separated him from his beloved Emma. The sun had nearly set now, painting the sky in deep purples and roses that reminded Emma of her mother's favorite dress. Sarah Morrison had worn that dress to church every Sunday, had been buried in it 3 years ago when the cancer finally claimed her. Emma often wondered if her mother could see her from heaven, if she knew how lost her father had become since her passing. "Mama would know what to do," Emma whispered to Ranger, her voice barely audible above the sound of Samuel's labored breathing and the steady scrape of metal against earth. She always knew how to make Daddy listen when he got stubborn. Sarah Morrison had been the heart of their family, the gentle voice of reason that could calm Samuel's occasional storms of temper. She'd been the one who taught Emma about love and kindness, who'd explained that sometimes adults made mistakes when they were scared or hurting. If Sarah were alive, she would have seen through Mrs. Henderson's gossip immediately. She would have sat her husband down, made him a cup of coffee, and talked sense into him before his fear could drive him to such desperate measures. The hole was nearly 5 feet deep now, and Samuel was beginning to struggle with each shovelful of dirt. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cooling evening air, and his hands were raw from gripping the wooden handle. But he wouldn't stop until this terrible task was complete. In his alcohol-clouded mind, he was protecting Emma from a lifetime of shame and disgrace. A coyote called from somewhere in the distance, its lonely howl echoing across the prairie. Ranger's ears pricked forward at the sound, and he moved closer to Emma, his large body providing a barrier between her and the unknown, dangers that might lurk in the growing darkness. But the real danger wasn't in the wild places beyond the ranch boundaries. It was right here, in the form of a father whose love had been twisted into something unrecognizable by fear and misunderstanding. Emma could see lights beginning to flicker on in houses across the valley. The Henderson place was visible from here, a white farmhouse with green shutters, where Tommy was probably doing his homework at the kitchen table under his mother's watchful eye. Did he know about his mother's gossip? Did he understand that her innocent words had set in motion events that could destroy the very love she'd tried to describe? "I wish I could fly to Tommy's house," Emma told Ranger, her small hands stroking the stallion's powerful neck. "I wish I could tell him what's happening. He'd help us. I know he would." Ranger nickered softly in response, as if he understood every word. The bond between them had always been extraordinary, built on 3 years of shared grief, mutual comfort, and unconditional love. When Emma had nightmares about her mother's death, it was Ranger who somehow knew, appearing at her bedroom window and whinnying softly until she came outside to sit with him under the stars. When she was lonely, he seemed to materialize from wherever he'd been grazing, ready to carry her across the vast ranch lands where she could forget her troubles in the rhythm of his steady gait. The first fireflies began to blink among the tall grass, tiny signals of hope in the growing darkness. Emma used to catch them in mason jars with her mother, releasing them after a few minutes with wishes for good dreams and peaceful sleep. Now, watching their gentle dance, she made a different kind of wish. She wished her father would remember who he really was beneath the fear and alcohol. She wished he would see her as his little girl, not as a source of shame and disgrace. Samuel paused in his digging, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The hole was deep enough now, he thought with grim satisfaction, deep enough to hide his shame, to preserve his family's honor. He looked up at Emma, sitting so still beside her golden horse, and for a moment his resolve wavered. She was so small, so innocent-looking in her yellow sundress with the little daisies. Her auburn hair caught the last rays of sunlight like a halo, and her blue eyes, Sarah's eyes, watched him with a mixture of love and fear that pierced through the fog of bourbon and desperation that clouded his mind. "Emma," he called out, his voice hoarse from exertion and emotion. "Come here, sweetheart, it's time." But instead of moving toward him, Emma pressed closer to Ranger's side. The stallion seemed to sense what those words meant, and his muscles tensed as if preparing to spring into action. A low rumble emanated from deep in his chest, a sound that was neither whinny nor snort, but something far more primal and protective. "I'm not coming, Daddy," Emma said, her voice small but surprisingly steady. "I'm not coming, because I'm not what you think I am. I'm not ashamed, and I'm not a disgrace to our family. I'm just a little girl who loves a little boy, and there's nothing wrong with that." Her words carried across the evening air with crystal clarity, but Samuel's mind couldn't process their meaning. All he could hear was defiance. All he could see was the source of his family's impending ruin. The shovel felt heavy in his hands as he prepared to climb out of the hole to do what he believed needed to be done. That's when Ranger made his decision. The powerful stallion had watched long enough, had waited for Samuel to come to his senses. But now, with Emma's refusal to approach and the growing desperation in her father's movements, the horse's protective instincts overrode years of training and domestication. With a sound that was part scream and part battle cry, Ranger reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air as he challenged the man who threatened his beloved Emma. The sight was magnificent and terrifying. 16 hands of golden power and barely contained fury silhouetted against the darkening sky. Emma gasped and stepped back, not from fear of Ranger, but from amazement at his display of protective fury. She'd never seen him like this, never witnessed the wild spirit that still lived beneath his gentle, domesticated exterior. Samuel dropped the shovel and stumbled backward in the hole, his eyes wide with shock. For the first time since Mrs. Henderson's phone call that morning, something had penetrated the fog of his desperation. The sight of Ranger in full protective mode, defending Emma with every fiber of his being, reminded Samuel of something he'd almost forgotten. This was his daughter, his precious little girl. And no matter what anyone said, no matter what gossip swirled through Millfield County, she deserved his protection, not his violence. Ranger's powerful cry echoed across the Morrison ranch like a call to arms, carrying on the evening wind far beyond the boundaries of their property. In the growing darkness, that sound reached the ears of neighbors who had known Samuel Morrison all their lives, people who understood that something was terribly wrong when a horse screamed like that. Sheriff Bob Whitman was the first to respond. He'd been sitting on his own front porch just 2 miles down County Road 47, enjoying his evening coffee and watching the fireflies dance among his wife's rose bushes, when Ranger's call shattered the peaceful twilight. Bob had been in law enforcement for 23 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. The sound that drifted across the valley was one of distress, of danger, and it was coming from the Morrison place. Emma felt Ranger's muscles quivering beneath his golden coat as he slowly lowered himself back to all 4 hooves. The stallion remained alert, his ears pinned back and his dark eyes fixed on Samuel, who stood frozen in the hole he'd dug beneath the old oak tree. For a moment, the 3 of them formed a strange tableau. Man, child, and horse locked in a confrontation that would determine the course of all their lives. "Easy, boy," Emma whispered, her small hand moving in slow circles on Ranger's neck. "Easy now." But the horse's breathing remained rapid and shallow, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the scent of fear and desperation that hung heavy in the air. Ranger had seen Samuel upset before, had witnessed the man's struggles with grief and loneliness. in the years since Sarah's death, but this was different. This carried the scent of danger, of violence barely held in check, and every instinct in the stallion's body screamed at him to protect the child he loved more than his own life. Samuel stared up at them from the bottom of his makeshift grave, the shovel lying forgotten at his feet. Ranger's display had shocked him into a moment of clarity, and in that clarity, doubt began to seep through the cracks in his alcohol-fueled determination. His daughter looked so small standing beside the magnificent horse, her yellow dress now wrinkled from pressing close to Ranger's side, her auburn hair catching the last rays of sunlight like spun copper. "Emma," he said, his voice gentler now but still rough with emotion. "You don't understand what this means for our family, what people will say about us, about you." "But they're wrong, Daddy," Emma replied, her voice gaining strength from Ranger's protective presence. "Mrs. Henderson is wrong about me. I'm not having a baby. I don't even know how babies are made. I just know that I love Tommy, and loving someone isn't something to be ashamed of." Her words hung in the cooling air like a prayer, simple and innocent and heartbreakingly true. But Samuel's mind, still clouded by bourbon and the weight of perceived shame, struggled to process what she was telling him. All he could think about were the whispers that would follow their family, the pointed fingers, the way people would look at them in church on Sunday morning. That's when the headlights appeared on the long gravel drive that led to the Morrison ranch. Sheriff Whitman's patrol car moved slowly up the winding road, its headlights cutting through the gathering darkness like searchlights seeking the truth. Bob had called ahead to Pastor James McKenna at the First Baptist Church, knowing that if Samuel Morrison was in trouble, he'd listen to his spiritual leader before he'd listen to anyone else. Behind the sheriff's car came Pastor McKenna's old blue pickup truck, followed by the Henderson family's white sedan. Tommy Henderson sat in the back seat, his young face pressed against the window, his heart pounding with a fear he didn't fully understand. His mother had been acting strange all day, whispering into the telephone and casting guilty glances in his direction whenever she thought he wasn't looking. "What's happening?" Tommy had asked when his father announced they were driving over to the Morrison place. "Why is everyone acting so weird?" But neither of his parents had given him a straight answer, and now, as their car pulled up to the Morrison farmhouse, Tommy could see lights and movement near the old oak tree where he and Emma had shared their first kiss just 1 week ago. Emma heard the car doors slamming and saw the flashlight beams beginning to move across the yard. "Someone's coming," she told Ranger, relief flooding through her voice. "People are coming to help us." Sheriff Whitman reached them first, his heavy flashlight beam illuminating the shocking scene. Samuel Morrison standing in a hole that was clearly grave-sized, his daughter and her horse watching him from behind the fence with expressions of terror and defiance. Bob had seen a lot of things in his years as sheriff, but this sight sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "Samuel!" he called out, his voice carrying the authority of 23 years in law enforcement, but also the concern of a lifelong friend. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" Samuel blinked in the harsh light of the flashlight, suddenly aware of how his actions must look to others. "Bob," he said, his voice cracking with strain, she's... The shame of it, Bob. The shame is going to destroy us." Pastor McKenna arrived next, breathing heavily from his hurried walk across the uneven ground. At 67 years old, James McKenna had been the spiritual shepherd of Millfield County for over 30 years. He'd baptized Emma Morrison as a baby, had officiated at her mother's funeral, and had watched Samuel struggle with grief and alcohol in the years since Sarah's death. "Samuel Morrison," the pastor said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to step out of that hole and talk to me." But before Samuel could respond, the Henderson family approached, and suddenly the terrible misunderstanding that had set this tragedy in motion began to unravel. Mrs. Henderson took one look at the scene, the grave-sized hole, Emma's tear-stained face, Samuel's wild-eyed desperation and understanding dawned on her like a cold sunrise. "Oh, my Lord," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Samuel, what have I done?" 12-year-old Tommy Henderson broke away from his parents and ran toward the fence where Emma stood with Ranger. "Emma!" he called out, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Emma, are you okay?" The sight of Tommy, her best friend and first love, broke through the shell of fear that had surrounded Emma since her father began digging. "Tommy!" she cried, reaching through the fence rails to grasp his hand. "He thinks I'm having a baby, but I'm not. I told him I'm not, but he won't listen." The truth hit the gathered adults like a physical blow. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her face pale in the flashlight beams. "Samuel," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her mistake. "I was wrong. Dear God, I was wrong about Emma." Sheriff Whitman kept his flashlight trained on Samuel, who remained in the hole but had begun to tremble visibly. "Talk to me, Samuel," Bob said. "Help me understand what's happening here." "She told me," Samuel began, then stopped, confusion clouding his features. "Margaret Henderson called this morning, said she saw Emma at the clinic in Beaumont, said she was—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the words that had driven him to such desperate measures. Mrs. Henderson stepped closer, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I saw her in the waiting room, looking sick. I assumed—" "Oh, Samuel, I'm so sorry." "She was car sick from the long ride, just car sick. Tommy had his checkup, and Emma came along for the trip to the city. That's all it was." The key. Words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread through the gathered group. Pastor McKenna closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude, while Sheriff Whitman felt his hand relax on his weapon. But it was Ranger who seemed to understand first. The great stallion's ears pricked forward, and the tension in his muscles began to ease as he sensed the shift in the human emotions around him. The scent of immediate danger was fading, replaced by something else: shame, regret, and the beginning of understanding. Emma looked from her father to Mrs. Henderson, to the gathering crowd of neighbors and friends who had come in response to Ranger's call for help. "I tried to tell him," she said, her voice small but clear in the evening air. "I tried to tell him I wasn't having a baby. I'm just in love with Tommy, and there's nothing wrong with that." Samuel Morrison looked up from the bottom of his self-dug grave, seeing his daughter clearly for perhaps the first time since that terrible phone call that morning. She was 12 years old, innocent and pure, and frightened by her father's inexplicable behavior. The shame he'd been so desperate to avoid wasn't in her condition. It was in his own actions, his willingness to believe gossip over his own child's words. "Emma," he whispered, the shovel falling from his numb fingers. "Oh God, Emma, what have I done?" Ranger nickered softly, a sound that was almost conversational, as if he were offering his own form of forgiveness. The horse had seen the change in Samuel's posture, had sensed the lifting of the terrible weight that had driven the man to such desperate measures. But the night wasn't over yet. Samuel Morrison still stood in a grave-sized hole beneath the oak tree where his daughter had discovered first love, and the community that had gathered to save Emma would now have to find a way to save her father from the consequences of his own desperation and fear. The truth settled over the Morrison ranch like morning dew, gentle but transformative, washing away the poison of misunderstanding that had nearly destroyed a family. Sheriff Whitman holstered his flashlight and extended his hand down into the hole where Samuel Morrison stood, looking up at the faces of people who had known him all his life. "Come on up, Samuel," Bob said quietly. "Let's get you out of there." But Samuel remained frozen, staring at his dirt-caked hands as the full weight of what he'd almost done crashed over him like an avalanche. "I was going to," he began, then stopped, unable to voice the terrible words. The bourbon that had clouded his judgment was wearing off, leaving behind a clarity that was almost too painful to bear. Pastor McKenna stepped closer to the edge of the hole, his weathered face kind but serious in the beam of the flashlights. "Samuel, the Lord forgives all sins," he said gently. "But first, you need to forgive yourself and ask for your daughter's forgiveness." Emma released Tommy's hand and approached the fence, her small face streaked with tears, but glowing with hope. Ranger moved with her, step for step, his golden coat shimmering in the artificial light as he maintained his protective position beside his beloved girl. "Daddy!" Emma called out, her voice stronger now than it had been all evening. "I forgive you, but you have to climb out now. You have to come back to us." The simple words from his 12-year-old daughter cut through Samuel's paralysis more effectively than all the adult voices around him. With Sheriff Whitman's help, he climbed out of the hole that had almost become Emma's grave, his legs shaking as his feet touched solid ground again. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her face wet with tears of guilt and relief. "Samuel, I owe you and Emma the deepest apology. My loose tongue and quick assumptions nearly caused an unspeakable tragedy. I saw what I thought I saw, but I didn't see the truth." Samuel looked at her with eyes that were clearer now, the fog of alcohol and desperation finally lifting. "Margaret," he said hoarsely, "we both made mistakes tonight, but Emma—" He turned toward his daughter, who was watching him with those blue eyes so much like her mother's. "Emma tried to tell me the truth and I wouldn't listen." Pastor McKenna placed a gentle hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Sometimes we're so afraid of losing what we love that we become the very thing that threatens it," he said quietly. "But love isn't about protecting our pride, Samuel. It's about protecting each other." Tommy Henderson had been listening to the adult conversation with growing understanding, his young mind piecing together the terrible misunderstanding that had led to this moment. Now he approached the fence where Emma stood, his face serious, beyond his 13 years. "Mr. Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. "I love your daughter, sir, not in any way that should bring shame to your family. I love her the way kids our age love each other, with our whole hearts but with innocence, and someday when we're old enough, I want to marry her with your blessing." The simple honesty of the boy's declaration seemed to unlock something in Samuel's chest that had been frozen since Sarah's death. These children weren't a source of shame. They were a source of hope. A reminder that love could grow even in the darkest soil of grief and loss. Sheriff Whitman cleared his throat, bringing everyone's attention back to the practical matters at hand. "Samuel, I can't pretend this didn't happen, but given the circumstances, the misunderstanding, and the fact that no actual harm was done." He paused, looking around at the gathered neighbors who had all known the Morrison family for decades. "I think this is a matter for the community to handle, not the courts." Dr. Patricia Wells, who had arrived with the second wave of concerned neighbors, stepped forward. She was the only doctor in Millfield County and had delivered half the children in town, including Emma 12 years ago. "Samuel needs help," she said firmly but kindly. "Professional help to deal with his grief and his drinking, but he also needs our support." Emma climbed through the fence rails, ignoring the adults' warnings about her safety. She walked directly to her father, who knelt down to meet her at eye level. In the harsh glare of the flashlights, with the terrible hole he'd dug as a backdrop, father and daughter faced each other with honesty for the first time since Sarah's death. "I miss Mama too," Emma whispered, throwing her arms around Samuel's neck. "But she wouldn't want us to hurt each other because we're sad." Samuel held his daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair that still carried traces of the honeysuckle shampoo Sarah used to buy at the general store. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," he whispered back. "I'm so sorry I didn't listen. I'm so sorry I let my fear turn into something ugly." The embrace lasted several long minutes, father and daughter clinging to each other as if trying to bridge 3 years of emotional distance in a single moment. Around them, the gathered neighbors watched in respectful silence, many wiping away tears of their own as they witnessed the beginning of healing. Ranger approached slowly, his hooves making soft sounds on the packed earth. The great stallion had watched the reconciliation between father and daughter with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Now he moved close enough to rest his great head over both of them, completing a circle of protection and love that would bind them together in healing. Pastor McKenna smiled at the sight, recognizing a miracle when he saw one. "Sometimes," he said to the gathered neighbors, "God sends us angels in the most unexpected forms." Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes and approached Emma with hesitant steps. "Sweet child," she said, "can you ever forgive a foolish old woman who spoke without thinking?" Emma looked up from her father's embrace, her face serene despite the trauma of the evening. "Mrs. Henderson, Mama always said that mistakes are just opportunities to do better next time. Maybe next time you'll ask questions before you make assumptions." The gentle reproach from a 12-year-old girl carried more weight than any angry words could have. Mrs. Henderson nodded solemnly, understanding that she'd received a gift of forgiveness she didn't deserve, but would treasure forever. "From now on," Margaret Henderson said, her voice thick with emotion, "I promise to think twice before I speak once. And Emma, if you and Tommy ever need anything at all, you come to me. I owe you both a debt I can never fully repay." Tommy joined them inside the fence now, his young face bright with relief. "Emma," he said shyly, "I brought you something." He pulled a small wildflower from his pocket, a yellow daisy that matched the ones on her dress. "I picked it on the way over. I thought you might need something pretty tonight." Emma accepted the flower with a smile that seemed to light up the entire ranch. "Thank you, Tommy, it's perfect." She turned to her father, who was watching the exchange with newfound understanding. "Daddy, this is what love looks like when you're 12. It's flowers and hand-holding and promises for the future. It's innocent and beautiful, just like Mama said love should be." Samuel nodded, finally seeing his daughter's relationship with Tommy through clear eyes. "Your mother would have loved seeing you so happy," he said softly. "I'm sorry I was too blind to see it myself." Sheriff Whitman began organizing the cleanup, enlisting the help of the gathered neighbors to fill in the hole that Samuel had dug. Working together in the light of their flashlights and the bright beam of Dr. Wells' emergency lantern, the community literally covered the evidence of the night's near tragedy, transforming the scar in the earth back into solid ground. As they worked, more neighbors arrived, drawn by phone calls and the small-town network that could mobilize an entire community in times of crisis. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez brought coffee and sandwiches from her kitchen. Old Jake Patterson, despite his arthritis, insisted on helping shovel dirt. Even the teenage Miller boys showed up, having heard something was wrong at the Morrison place. "This is what Sarah would have wanted," Pastor McKenna observed as he watched the community come together. "She always said that Millfield County was more than just a place on a map. It was a family." Samuel stood with Emma and Ranger, watching his neighbors and friends restore his property while he contemplated how to restore his life. Dr. Wells had already scheduled an appointment for him with a counselor in the county seat, and Pastor McKenna had arranged for daily check-ins to help him stay sober and process his grief. "It won't be easy," Pastor McKenna warned him quietly. "Recovery never is, but you don't have to do it alone." Samuel nodded, his arm around Emma's shoulders as she leaned against him with complete trust restored. "I want to be the father she deserves," he said. "The father Sarah would want me to be." "You already are," Emma said simply. "You just forgot for a while. But people who love each other help each other remember." As the work continued, stories began to emerge from the gathered neighbors. Mrs. Rodriguez shared how Samuel had helped her family when her husband died 5 years ago. Jake Patterson reminded everyone how Samuel had organized the whole county to search when little Billy Chen went missing last summer. The Miller boys talked about how Samuel had taught them to fix engines at his garage, never charging them a penny. "This man," Sheriff Whitman announced to the group, "made a terrible mistake tonight, but it doesn't erase a lifetime of being a good neighbor and a good man. We all have moments we're not proud of. The measure of a person isn't whether they fall down, it's whether they get back up." The hole was completely filled now, the earth tamped down solid and smooth. Someone had brought wildflower seeds from their garden, and they sprinkled them over the spot where the grave had been. By spring, this place would bloom with new life, a living testament to second chances and the power of community love. By the time the last of the equipment was put away and the final neighbor had said their goodbyes, it was nearly 1 in the morning. The Henderson family was among the last to leave, and Tommy walked slowly toward their car, reluctant to end this strange night that had somehow brought him and Emma closer together. "I'll see you at church tomorrow," he called out to Emma. "Save me a seat in Sunday school." "Always," Emma called back, her voice carrying across the yard like music. Mr. Henderson approached Samuel before getting in his car. "Samuel," he said quietly, "Margaret feels terrible about what happened. But maybe some good can come from this. Maybe our families can be closer now, help each other through the hard times." Samuel shook the man's hand, feeling the weight of genuine friendship in the gesture. "I'd like that, Robert. I'd like that very much." As the red taillights of the Henderson car disappeared down the gravel drive, the Morrison Ranch settled into peaceful quiet. Samuel and Emma sat together on the front porch steps, with Ranger grazing nearby, his golden coat silver in the moonlight that had finally emerged from behind the clouds. "Daddy," Emma said sleepily, her head resting against her father's shoulder, "are you going to be okay? Really okay, I mean?" Samuel considered the question seriously, knowing that his daughter deserved an honest answer. "I think so, sweetheart. Dr. Wells is going to help me find someone to talk to about missing your mama and about the drinking. Pastor McKenna is going to check on us every day. And you," he squeezed her gently, "you're going to help me remember what's really important." "What's really important?" Emma asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Love," Samuel said simply. "Love is what's really important. Love for each other, love for our neighbors, love for the life your mama gave us. Everything else is just noise." Ranger lifted his head from the grass and nickeled softly, as if he too could sense the presence of Sarah Morrison's gentle spirit in the evening breeze that rustled through the old oak tree. The hole was gone now, filled with fresh earth and the promise of new growth. By spring, wildflowers would bloom where trauma had almost taken root, and the old oak would continue to provide shade for generations of children who would play beneath its branches. "I love you, Daddy," Emma whispered as her eyes began to close. "I love you too, baby girl," Samuel whispered back. "More than life itself, and I promise I'll never forget that again." As Emma drifted off to sleep in her father's arms, Samuel remained awake, watching the stars and thinking about second chances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the counseling appointments, the daily struggle to stay sober, the work of rebuilding trust with his daughter. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of community love and holding his precious child close, Samuel Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 long years: hope. Ranger stood guard in the moonlight, like a golden sentinel protecting all he held dear. And somewhere in the star-filled sky above Texas, Sarah Morrison smiled down on her family, knowing that love had conquered fear once again, just as it always would in the end. Epilogue, 6 months later. The first warm Saturday of spring found the Morrison Ranch alive with activity and laughter. Samuel stood on the front porch, a glass of sweet tea in his hand instead of bourbon, watching as Emma and Tommy worked together in the garden that now bloomed where the terrible hole had been dug 6 months ago. True to the neighbor's promise, wildflowers had sprouted in abundance: bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans and purple cone flowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds from across the county. Emma had insisted on adding vegetables to the mix, and now neat rows of tomatoes and green beans grew alongside the wild beauty, creating a garden that was both practical and magical. "The carrots are coming up," Emma called out excitedly, pointing to tiny green shoots emerging from the dark soil. Tommy knelt beside her, equally enthusiastic about their shared project. At 13 and 12 respectively, they still held hands and shared innocent kisses, but their relationship had deepened into something more mature, a friendship built on trust and genuine care for each other's well-being. Samuel smiled as he watched them work. The counseling sessions in Beaumont had been difficult at first, forcing him to confront the grief he'd buried beneath anger and alcohol. Dr. Martinez, the therapist Dr. Wells had recommended, had helped him understand that his love for Sarah didn't require him to remain trapped in the past. Healing wasn't a betrayal of his wife's memory, it was the best way to honor it. The daily check-ins with Pastor McKenna had evolved into weekly counseling sessions that Samuel actually looked forward to. They talked about faith and forgiveness, about the difference between guilt and grief, about how to be both mother and father to a daughter who was growing up too fast. And the alcohol. Samuel had poured the last bottle down the kitchen sink 3 months ago, watching the amber liquid disappear down the drain like the ghosts of his worst impulses. Some days were harder than others, but the support group Dr. Wells had connected him with in the county seat provided him with tools and friendships that made sobriety not just possible, but preferable. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy called out, waving a muddy hand in Samuel's direction. "Come see how big the tomato plants are getting." Samuel set down his tea and joined the young gardeners, marveling at how much had grown in such a short time. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. Good things could grow quickly when they were planted in the right soil and tended with care. "Your mama would have loved this garden," he told Emma, kneeling down to examine a particularly robust tomato plant. "She always said that growing things was like raising children. You plant them with love, give them what they need to grow, and then trust them to become something beautiful." Emma's smile was radiant as she brushed dirt from her hands. "I don't think she can see it," she said with the simple faith that had carried her through the darkest night of their lives. "I think she's proud of us for making something beautiful grow here." Ranger grazed peacefully nearby, his golden coat gleaming in the afternoon sunshine. The stallion was never far from Emma's side, though his protective vigilance had relaxed. As the Morrison household had settled into healthier rhythms, he still slept in the pasture closest to the house, still came running whenever Emma called, but the desperate edge of his guardianship had softened into something more natural and sustainable. The sound of car tires on gravel announced the arrival. of the Henderson family, who had become regular visitors to the Morrison Ranch since that terrible night in October. Mrs. Henderson had kept her promise to think before she spoke, and her relationship with Emma had blossomed into something like a grandmother-granddaughter bond. She often brought fresh baked goods and stayed to help with household tasks that Samuel was still learning to manage. "How's my favorite gardener?" Mrs. Henderson called out as she approached with a basket of fresh-baked cookies. "And my favorite young man," she added, ruffling Tommy's hair with genuine affection. The transformation in Margaret Henderson had been remarkable. The guilt of her careless gossip had motivated her to become more thoughtful in all her interactions, and she'd emerged as one of Samuel's strongest supporters in his journey towards sobriety and emotional health. "We planted marigolds around the edges," Emma announced proudly. "They're supposed to keep the bugs away from the vegetables." "Smart thinking," Mrs. Henderson said approvingly. "Your mama taught you well about gardening, didn't she?" As the afternoon wore on, more neighbors began to arrive for what had become an unofficial tradition: Saturday gatherings at the Morrison Ranch. Sheriff Whitman came by with his wife and their twin daughters, who immediately enlisted Emma and Tommy's help in building a fort out of hay bales. Pastor McKenna arrived with his guitar, ready to lead the group in the hymn, singing that had become a beloved part of these gatherings. Dr. Wells stopped by to check on Samuel's progress, though her visits had long since ceased to be merely professional. She'd become a friend and advisor, someone who could offer both medical expertise and personal wisdom as Samuel navigated the challenges of single parenthood and recovery. "You look good," she told Samuel as they sat on the porch watching the children play. "Really good. How are you feeling?" "Grateful," Samuel said without hesitation. "Grateful and hopeful, I guess. I never thought I'd feel hopeful again after Sarah died." "Hope is a choice," Dr. Wells said gently, "and you've been making good choices for months now." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in the familiar shades of amber and rose that had once seemed threatening but now felt welcoming, the gathering settled into the peaceful rhythm of community fellowship. Pastor McKenna's guitar provided a gentle soundtrack as conversations flowed around the garden where transformation had taken root. Emma sat between her father and Tommy, Ranger's great head resting across her lap as she stroked his golden mane. "Daddy," she said quietly, "are you happy?" Samuel considered the question seriously, as he'd learned to do in counseling. Was he happy? The grief for Sarah would always be part of him, and the memory of that terrible October night would never completely fade. But sitting here, surrounded by friends and family, watching his daughter bloom like the flowers in their garden, feeling genuinely hopeful about the future for the first time in years. Yes, he thought he might actually be happy. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, pulling her close. "I think I am." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the Morrison Ranch seemed to glow with contentment. The old oak tree still provided shade and shelter, but now it sheltered laughter instead of despair, hope instead of fear. The garden that had grown from the site of near tragedy was thriving, a living testament to the power of second chances and the resilience of love. Ranger nickered softly in the gathering darkness, a sound of satisfaction and peace. The great stallion had kept his promise to protect Emma, had stood guard through the darkest night and the brightest day of recovery. Now he could rest easy, knowing that the family he loved was whole again, scarred but healed, stronger for having faced the darkness and chosen the light. In the distance, a coyote called across the prairie, but its voice no longer carried loneliness. Instead, it seemed to sing of wild spaces and untamed hope, of a world where love could overcome fear and communities could heal the wounds that isolation created. The Morrison Ranch was home again, in every sense of the word. And in the star-filled sky above Texas, Sarah Morrison's spirit smiled down on the garden where her memory lived on in every flower that bloomed, every vegetable that grew, every moment of joy that her husband and daughter chose to cultivate. In the fertile soil of forgiveness and grace, dear listeners, we hope that the story of Emma Morrison and her faithful horse Ranger has touched your hearts deeply. Sometimes the greatest threats to our children come not from the world around us, but from our own fears and misunderstandings. This tale reminds us that healing is possible, that communities can come together to lift up those who have fallen, and that love planted in good soil will always find a way to bloom. If you found meaning in this story of redemption and second chances, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments what moved you most. Here, every story is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, hope can take root and grow into something beautiful. Thank you for joining us on this journey from despair to healing.